All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Justice with Jax Season 2, Episode 7, which is going to be a bit of a recap of the season. And of course, as always, some gratitude. Today is Tuesday, November 26, 2024. And so that is 1 year, 3 months, 26 days since the case Armendariz versus City of Colorado Springs and the U.S. government, or the FBI, was filed by the ACLU of Colorado. That's also 484 days since the filing. So I can't believe it. We made it to now 13 total episodes, and boy, does time fly. Here we are in 2024, and I feel like and I may not be alone in feeling this, but it's some nightmare deja vu from either 2016 or even 2020, which was pretty tough times, right? And so in my case, once again, COVID has ruined some of the holidays. I'm going to try to recover from that. And here we are again with Trump on deck. And so I want to use this season recap to talk a little bit more about the electoral landscape ahead beyond 2024. And here's a great opportunity to just review the timeline as a whole for my case that's represented by the ACLU. And of course, like I said, we have some thank yous on deck. So think about it this way. When it comes to this podcast, I'm trying to tell, really my lived experience and bring along community voices in this community story because that's what's important. And so really this case started back in 2021 when there was a housing justice march here in Colorado Springs. We were still, if you remember the context of the time, still dealing with the impacts of the pandemic and what it means for housing to be a human right for all when something that serious was going on, when people couldn't pay their bills, their mortgages, their rent, etc. And so technically, the police activity that we discovered with the extent of our story goes back even a little bit further to Black Lives Matter summer, which is why Armendariz versus City of Colorado Springs is a case that may set some precedent in very specific areas of law that come to our actual information age, our digital era that we live in, and that our devices basically have a digital fingerprint of our entire lives. And so back in 2020, it turns out authorities were, scanning people's social media and seeing who was associated with who and what political speech they were saying, which is part of why, for the six of us involved in the housing march, it seemed like, especially my co plaintiff, Chinook Center, was a huge target for law enforcement simply because of the political speech and action that comes out of that leftist organizing nonprofit in our community. So let's say this started 2020, 2021. Here I am in 2024. That's how long what has happened to me with regard to the case of Armendariz versus City of Colorado Springs has now taken when it comes to my personal experience. There's a lot to say about walking into something that you didn't choose, right? But you're trying to make um, the best of by doing the right thing, let's say. And so, as viewers of this podcast know, then in 2021, when I was arrested under a false accusation that allowed police to confiscate all my electronic devices and essentially my words, the disclaimer of each episode, not a lawyer. And my word specifically is that, I felt violated. My information was essentially stolen because ultimately, being forced by this false accusation to enter the legal system, a year and a half later, 2022, I came out of being prosecuted with no charges whatsoever, no convictions. And that was something that was really striking because when I was able to reach that milestone of finally ending my own prosecution under these really, again, I say lies from the police, of course, that was important, but it still felt like there was a lot left undone because for the federal government to take the digital fingerprint of my life when I had never even been convicted of a crime and say that they have a right to that is a problem for our entire American democracy. And, that's why this case, I've made it my mission to make sure that the story is told. And again, part of why this podcast exists. That brings us through 2022. We're into 2023. I will always be utterly grateful. There's not enough words to say what it has meant for the ACLU of Colorado to choose to represent this case. The case was filed August 1, 2023, and here we are at the end of 2024 in November. And so I wanted to kind of give that perspective at the end of season 2, because there's a lot of ground that we've covered. As I always say on this show, this podcast is a vehicle for community voices and the story of this case to be told, because it does have a community impact. And so this is where we get to make a positive segue as we try to have balance on the show to the ground we covered during season 2 and why each guest was deliberately invited to share space here. Part of it being that they're some of the phenomenal people I know in this community, of which there are so many. So this season, we started off with the Colorado Springs Pro Housing Partnerships lead organizer, Max Kronstadt. And that was really important for this story because, like I mentioned already, part of why we were out in the streets and what made us a target is demanding that housing be a human right in this city, Colorado Springs. And so, you know, having Max talking about housing justice, to me, that is a piece of the continued accountability that we're going to keep pushing for as community organizers and activists and advocates. And then we amazingly had Rich Fierro of Atrevida Beer Company, who I am so grateful to say, privileged to say, is a dear friend of mine. And part of what we talked about is what it means to be thrust really onto a national stage out of a tragedy. In the case of Atrevida and other folks in our community, they're survivors of the Club Q mass shooting, which we just marked the 2-year remembrance of this month. And so, being leaders in the community and being vulnerable about these moments that frankly were pretty dark and yet really important, obviously, in our lives over our friendship was a powerful piece of the work that I felt I got to do and share with you this season. And so next we had Jeremy Dowell, who was our Democratic candidate for 4th Judicial District's DA race or district attorney race. And so want to give, the utmost thank you again to Jeremy for stepping up to run for office. While we didn't achieve victory as Democrats in that race this year, the fact that Jeremy ran in itself was a victory because we hadn't had anyone opposing Republicans on the ballot for, I think, about almost as long as I've been alive, sometime in the late 80s. So kudos to Jeremy for his role in that and the really smart and refreshing conversation that we were able to have about public safety. That was really inspiring to me on a personal level. It was actually one of the most viewed episodes of this season. And so thank you for making that happen together because couldn't have done it without you. Next, we had another incredible candidate, Naomi Lopez for County Commission District 3, another Democrat who ran an incredible race, and yet things being what they are in this political climate and in El County wasn't able to achieve victory, though her opponent is a huge disappointment to many in the community. And I think many were puzzled, shocked even, that Naomi's opponent won the race. And so that's another incredible episode where we talked about the perspective of local government at the county level, where maybe people, because life is busy, there's a lot going on, and I wouldn't call it simple, may not pay as much attention to county government, but they should, since there's a lot of impacts that we know all politics is local, like we like to say on this show. And so Naomi and I, as dear friends as well, to me had such an incredible conversation that, again, this job, as much as it's a labor of love because I don't get paid for this podcast, it has been an incredible experience to try to, frankly, transform some really dark truths into something of service for the community because information has a lot of value. Am I right, my friends? Which is, I think, why you're probably watching this podcast and this season 2 recap. And so finally, our two guests that wrapped up the season were Misha Smith, the dynamic and wonderful chair of the El Paso County Democratic Party. And I'm pleased to say another dear friend of mine, because I feel like it's only the best thing I get to do when I get to, you know, uplift the voices of people that I cherish in this community as well, who are really working their asses off, really working hard. So Misha has done much as the county party chair for the Democrats, including a lot of historical firsts, like being the first young person, being the first young Black woman as chair. And so we had a great conversation about our election 2024, which if you watched the last episode, which I'll get to talk about our guest in a second there, as much of a painful time and some straight up bullshit that we have as outcomes of election 2024, we got to remember the bright spots and the wins too. And so that leads us, speaking of wins, to our most recent episode, which I got to share with Jason Worf, who is the executive director of the Southern Colorado Cannabis Council. And again, another pleasure, privilege to say we go back because we are passionate advocates and activists, and that's what brings us together in terms of the specific advocacy we got to do through the council, especially when it comes to cannabis industry, all sorts of issues that we discussed on that episode. But one of the victories, one of the wins, to circle back, was ballot question 300 here in the city of Colorado Springs, which I'm sure there were some folks who thought we would never see recreational cannabis come to be law or city ordinance here in the city of Colorado Springs. And so that was, a key milestone to kind of take some framing for as we did a recap of election 2024 itself. And so that brings us to here, the wrap up. And I have a few notes on, what I wanted to share as we wrap up season 2. That's kind of my style, to take notes. Obviously, I wanted to share a big part of this show is its candor and even the vulnerability that myself and the guests may go through as we share some of our stories. And so, the outcome of Trump, and I'm going to continue to say, allegedly winning the 2024 presidential election was devastating, and we must take our time to mourn. And then what I've been trying to do is feel all my feelings and then use that to keep going forward. So would I tell you that the election of or re-election of Donald Trump brings me more confidence in the legal system? I wouldn't say that, but I really want to emphasize this next point is that even so, that does not mean we stop the work. In fact, it means that the work continues to be important more now than ever, which I recognize that people are maybe getting burned out on that phrasing that every election is the most important election of our lives. And yet, you can make an argument for that. So here we are in this painful, lame duck season where I think it's really, really important to put a finer point on this as well, which is that Joe Biden is, for all intents and purposes, a lame duck president, meaning there is not much necessarily that people would speculate he could do in between now and January when a new administration is set to occur. So that being said, we know, frankly, the devastating news that the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, recently granted, now again, a layman here, but recently granted what many are categorizing as presidential almost superpowers. And this comes in the context of a world with Donald Trump, meaning that many have interpreted the Supreme Court's ruling to essentially indicate that a sitting president could commit a crime and not be prosecuted, which is truly disturbing, which is why that was a devastating piece of news that in this truly challenging election and political climate, that news may not have risen to the top. And so putting a finer point on things, if that's the case where the president of the United States now has really unfettered immunity. I think that Joe Biden should really consider what he could do that's in the best interest of the American people at this point. Now, there's a lot of suggestions out there on that one. And I think one of the most important ones to give voice to at this point in the timeline, I'm going to shout out my dad here, Gilbert Armendariz. He is one of many, I would say, working on this campaign currently. So, giving a little bit more context when it comes to Donald Trump, we may have also seen that Donald Trump no longer faces prosecution when it comes to election interference, and so is not facing any accountability for his actions that incited January 6th, though some people would largely say he's admitted as much. We know that the prosecutor, special prosecutor Jack Smith, submitted a dismissal citing that Donald Trump is the president elect. He's not my president, never was, never will be. This is what is happening in our timeline, and I'm naming it. And so, these things being true, something that Joe Biden could do, which shout out dad and the many people working on this campaign, is actually enforce a section of US Code Title 5, Section 7311, which essentially that part of our US law, our federal law, states that anyone who has been associated or even spoken to the point of insurrection and treason against our US government, anyone that has committed those crimes or even those actions is then disqualified, is not eligible to be holding the office of President of the United States. So, hey, Joe Biden, if you're listening to this podcast, please enforce federal law and make sure that what our law says in the United States holds someone like Donald Trump accountable, despite everything we've seen previously. I know it sounds like I'm asking for a miracle, but it's right there in US code and section. So that's pretty incredible, right? Like, it's something that I feel like has come up time and time again on this show, which is when it comes to enforcing the law may be there, but a lot of times the onus is on the individual without the power to enforce that law through the legal system. And sometimes the way our systems are structured are extremely flawed, right? And some people would even argue that these flawed systems are actually performing the way that they were designed to, with inequity really embedded in them. And those are much larger and longer conversations, but I make it a point to raise this issue on Justice with Jax because that's what we're about here, justice. And so, are we witnessing yet again where there's a law that exists that should be enforced against someone like Donald Trump, right? Of all people, this global figure for some of the darkest reasons. I mean, Donald Trump isn't a well-known name because of the goodness and in his heart and the prosperity he's brought to our country. And so I just want to recognize that that is another difficult part of this timeline. That's one call to action that we can have during this wrap up is that you can join the many folks asking Joe Biden to enforce our federal law that obviously shows Donald Trump is ineligible, disqualified from holding the office of US president because he was involved in the January 6, 2021 insurrection. So that's a mouthful. I also want to share, as we try to do with some balance on this show, right? There are good things happening in the community all the time, places to be with people you can find solidarity and learn more because knowledge is power. And so I want to shout out that the Colorado College, several departments have come together. They are the Film and Media Studies Department, Sociology, Political Science, and History Department. They're hosting a community screening of Reimagining Safety which is going to feature the Prison Abolition Project and information about Stop Cop City, Colorado Springs. And it seems there will be a Q&A with the director, Matthew Solomon, and community organizers. And so it is going to be on, let's see, Thursday, December 5 at 7 p.m. Doors will open at 6:30. It is in the Cornerstone Screening Room, 825 North Cascade Avenue, Colorado Springs. So that's going to be something I think that would be worthy of attending. I am going to plan to be there. And otherwise, this is the best time in the show to remind you that episodes of Justice with Jax are recorded as a member of the Studio 809 Podcast Collective at the Nexus Community Co-working Space in downtown Colorado Springs. So remember to ask yourself 2 questions. Who's telling your story? And how are you being the change you want to see in the world today? So this is Justice with Jax signing off for season 2. We'll see you in 2025.